On it.
Slide to.
Oh, 3 people are waiting.
How?
I think
5
it's
are watching.
How?
1, 2, and 3.
Oh yeah.
5 are watching. Oh, mute. Oh wait, I can do that, right? I'm supposed to be doing that.
Fridays for Future's first ever live stream. This live stream is titled The Climate Crisis, Why Care? And this is held in collaboration, in commemoration of the Global Day of Climate Action. So, Minh, do you want to tell us a bit more about who Fridays for Future is?
Right. So, for those of you who don't know, Fridays for Future Singapore, that's us. We are the local branch of the Global Fridays for Future International Movement. Fridays for Future is a youth activist movement that advocates for climate action throughout the world through demonstrations, civil advocacy, and, given the current circumstances, I guess live streams like these. Yeah. So this live stream specifically is in commemoration of Global Climate Action Day, which was actually yesterday, but we wanted to hold it today so that all of you could, attend. So for Global Climate Action Day, we had people all around the world doing strikes, demonstrations, and rallies, both digital as well as physical. And yeah, our theme this year is about fighting climate injustice, and specifically with a focus on the global south, or as we prefer to call it, the most affected people and areas. So yeah.
And with that in mind, some of our speakers today will represent these people. So so our first speaker is himself from Philippines, who is in the group called Youth Advocates for Climate Action. And they are the Filipino branch of Fridays for Future there. And he will share with us more about what they did. So if you've been, you may have seen that yesterday, Yaka, they have actually also had physical rallies outside in protest for better climate action. And after that, we will have a speaker from Indonesia who will be talking to us more about coal. Yeah, so as you know, fossil fuels are the major source of all the carbon dioxide in our air. So one of the ways that people are trying to stop it is to phase out from coal, is to stop burning fossil fuels. And our speaker from Indonesia will tell us more about coal in Indonesia and what they're trying to do to stop, and maybe how we can move to a more renewable future in terms of energy production.
Right. So sort of the reason why we're bringing together all these speakers from not just Singapore, where we do have local speakers that will talk about what Singapore is doing, and how climate activism and climate action is in Singapore. But we've also brought along speakers from overseas, regionally, the Philippines and Indonesia. So we wanted to bring them along because, well, number one, the time zones match up, so we can like bring someone from the EU. I think it's like.
Is anybody logged into YouTube as Fridays for Future?
I don't think so. Why? How are we hanging already? It's like the start. When did we hang?
Gaman. Sorry?
When did we hang?
Are you off? I think
Yeah,
Wow.
mute yourself.
We hang already.
All right, so after we had technical difficulty, we are back, and well, I hope we are back. So it's our
Not back yet.
it's our first speaker ready. Xian,
He's already on.
sorry, all right. So anyways, let's just talk a bit more about how the climate situation is like in the Philippines. I think one of the things that make headlines in the international community is the new terror law. It's the new terror law, right?
Yeah, it's the new terror, right?
It's starting soon.
So it's not technically called the terror law, but everyone calls it the terror law because
Oh,
yeah, that's what it actually amounts to. Essentially, it's a lot of restrictions on activism in the Philippines, not just environmental activism, but activism as a whole. And so in that context, we brought on Xian Guevarra from Young Climate Youth Young Climate Advocates Philippines to talk about what climate activism is like in the Philippines, what the impact of climate change has been on local communities, and how they plan on continuing the climate cause given such restrictions. Yeah.
all right. So I think Xian is here. Oh, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Hello. You can unmute
Hi
yourself.
there. Hi guys.
Hi, guys. Would you like to introduce a bit more about yourself?
All right. Okay, so hi, good afternoon to everyone who's watching us live from the Fridays for Future Singapore YouTube channel, and for everyone that is with us today. I am Xian Guevarra, the National Coordinator for Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, and I am here to talk to you guys about what YACAP is and what we are doing basically, and why climate justice and people knowing more about climate actions all over the world is very important, and what we can do to help each other out.
All right. Sounds great.
All right, so do I start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Go
All
ahead.
right. So, yeah, let me start. So first, let me talk about who YACAP is, what we are, what we do as an organization, and yeah, so basically, we are the Fridays for Future counterpart in the Philippines, and Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines is an alliance of different individuals, youth groups, and student councils all over the Philippines. And we basically have 5 points of unities. The first one is climate justice. We have to understand that climate justice is very important in the climate, in being a climate activist. The second one is when we talk about climate action, it has to be urgent. So the urgency of climate action is our second point of unity. The third one is youth-led collective action. So if we look at the trend all over the world, climate activism isn't new. But what is emerging right now is that the youth are taking the lead in climate action. So even if this is a multi-sectoral struggle, the farmers, the fisherfolk, the workers, the women, and everyone else basically is should be involved in this action. The youth is taking the lead because we are basically the ones that will inherit the planet. The fourth one is the defense of environmental defenders. I think Hongyu and Ming had already given you guys a briefer on what the terror law is, so I can talk to you guys more about that later on. But yeah, basically in the Philippines, and not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world, there is how do they call it? There's a big threat to different activists and different environmental defenders. So the point of unity of defending those defenders is very important, not just in the Philippines, but in the entire world. And lastly, our point of unity is system change. We all know that the climate crisis is a very big thing. And the only way to actually solve it is when we shift from this profit oriented system that puts profit over the planet and over its people, until we change that into something that's pro people and pro environment. That is only when we can actually address the climate crisis. So let me first talk about what is happening in the Philippines and maybe some parts of the world, so you guys would understand um, the possible effects that it can have to different races and to different people. And while you guys in Singapore do not necessarily feel that, it doesn't mean that it's not actually happening. So me personally, I come from Manila, which is the city center of the Philippines. And here in Manila, I could actually say that the impact of the climate crisis isn't that big as opposed to the ones in the rural cities. Okay, so me, I can say that I am privileged enough in such a way that when there's a big storm that comes up and there's flooding, immense flooding, or maybe when there's a drought, I don't feel any of it. When there's a big storm and when there's flooding, I see it on the news. But me personally, the biggest impact that that can happen to me is me having slow internet connection or probably disruptions in our electrical services. But that's it. So does that mean that me not feeling exactly what happens during these calamities, should I not care? Well, that's the thing. We should actually care even more because we are privileged enough to not be affected by these calamities and these effects of climate change, but we can actually do something and actually reach out to more people as opposed to people who are in the countryside or in the rural areas that do not have any internet connections at all. With this pandemic going on, it's very hard here in the Philippines. The strikes that we have from physical ones to the on-ground ones, we suddenly have to shift into the online sphere. We now do webinars, we now do online strikes, and basically just tweet and post it on Facebook and on different social media platforms. That's what we are doing right now. Okay, so us as privileged people who don't necessarily feel that, it's up to us now to amplify the voices of those who are not heard. Okay, it's not true that they're voiceless. Okay, we are not giving a voice to them because they already have a voice, but their voice is unheard. That's why us Filipinos in the cities, or you guys maybe in Singapore, with you guys not feeling, I can't speak about the situation in Singapore, but in reality, as opposed to the Philippines, we all know that Singapore is doing quite better in terms of COVID-19 response, in terms of response to the climate emergency. Okay, so that is why it is very, very important for us to work together to amplify basically the voices of everyone else who are in the most affected peoples and areas. So let me talk more about the situation here in the Philippines, aside from those calamities. There's also a problem with climate education. So when we talk about climate education, here in the Philippines, what's being taught to us is, okay, there's reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's it. Okay, when we talk about global warming, when we talk about climate change, the answer that's being fed to us when we talk about climate education is that do reduce, reuse, recycle, and that's it. But in reality, that is not the case. If we try to reduce, reuse, recycle, that is a very good thing. Okay, I am not discrediting or discounting those things, but we have to remember that doing those things alone is not actually enough. Okay, the accountability has to fall on the biggest polluters and emitters of the world. Okay, so that means companies that are there are, according to studies, there are 100 companies, and those 100 companies alone contribute 71% of the global emissions. Okay, and when we talk about countries, USA and China, they are the biggest emitters. USA historically is the biggest emitter. Right now, currently, China is the biggest emitter. So in terms of responsibility, should it fall on Philippines, us as a developing country who is one of the most affected peoples and areas, but we are not actually contributing that much to emissions. So we have to learn those as well. When we talk about climate education, we have to arm people basically with the education that is needed for them to take action. Okay? So the next part will be basically the environmental defenders. So the Philippines, if you guys have not heard, we are the first in Asia and second in the entire world that is the most deadliest place for environmental defenders. Here in the Philippines, environmental defenders or climate activists are being tagged as terrorists. That's why they have the terror law. Here in the Philippines, if you are a climate activist or any activist in general, you can be jailed. You can be you can have false charges given to you, and you can actually be killed. So it's not surprising that more and more activists in the Philippines are being scared. And as far as I know, in Singapore, climate crisis and what is happening all over the world, the wildfires, the strong storms, the strong floodings, those kinds of things, the polar ice caps melting. Okay, while we do not necessarily experience that, we actually know that that is happening and that is true. Okay, so on our end, we should educate more and more and more people about climate action and the climate crisis for them to take action. We have a pattern here when we talk about activism. It's three things. The first one is you arouse people. Arouse meaning make them understand why it's very important and why we should act. Why this is something that is urgent and why this is something that we have to basically um, we have to do something about it. Okay, so once you've aroused them, once they know that this is very important and they should do something about it, the next thing that you do is organize them. Okay, so when we talk about organizations or organizing people, you have to put them in organizations or in alliances. Make them understand that doing things collectively is stronger than doing things individually. So when we talk about, for example, mobilizations, if you're just one person on the streets holding a placard or holding a sign or a banner, people might not listen to you. But if you are a million people and all of you guys are shouting and saying that we want climate action, we want urgent climate action, that is actually something that you guys, that people would think now, why are they actually doing this? Why are there a lot of people on the streets mobilizing and talking about climate change? So when we talk about organizing people, it's letting people know what options there are in terms of organization. So once they find their advocacies, there are many advocacy groups, not just in the Philippines or the entire world, but even in Singapore. I believe that there are many different advocacy groups, not just about environment and about climate. Okay, so when we tell people to go into organizations, make them go into organizations that fit their advocacies the best and fit their work style the best. So even in the Philippines, we have different environmental groups, okay? And what YACAP does is, since we are an alliance, we are trying to collaborate with different environmental groups. So there we have environmental groups that focus on saving the seas. We have environmental groups that focus on uh, waste to energy, no to waste to energy, environmental defenders. So what YACAP does is we make them collaborate with one another and see the common denominators in their advocacies. Okay, so Fridays for Future Singapore can be that as well. Okay, you guys can help different environmental groups talk to each other and talk to whoever needs to be talked to. If that's your government, possibly help in passing better bills, or your politicians talk to them on what they can actually do to support the climate campaigns. Okay, and then lastly, after you've aroused people, make them know why this is important, and then you to organize them. The next one is to act. Okay, to mobilize, to actually do something about it. And then once again, mobilization is not just limited to protests. Okay, mobilizations can come in all forms of actions. That can be a signature campaign, a petition, you actually having a dialogue with your government officials. That's also part of mobilization, of acting. Okay, so I am giving you guys this pattern to hopefully help you guys understand what you guys can actually do. Okay, and yes, the environmental activism may not necessarily be that, what do you call this, popular in Singapore as opposed to the Philippines or in other countries. But we have to understand the first point. We have to arouse people and make them understand why this is very urgent. So webinars like these is a very helpful tool to make people know and understand more why we are doing these things, why we are mobilized, why we are talking about the climate crisis all over the world, not just in Singapore, not just in Philippines, not just Asia, but the entire world. Okay, so basically that's it. If you guys have any more questions, any more comments or concerns, I am free to answer those live. But yeah, basically that's it. We have to remember that while we may not be in the situation where we feel the climate crisis, we are in the situation wherein we can actually amplify the voices of those unheard. That's why we should all work together and act together to have genuine climate action. All right. Thank you, guys.
Hi. Thank you, Xiang, for that very interesting sharing. And I feel like it echoes a lot of about the things that happen right here in Singapore as well. Right, because I think when you talk about how like all we've been told is the three answers, actually what happens here also we've just been told, oh, you should just reduce, recycle. You should just turn off the light and like don't talk about about oil, about all of these big issues. And yeah, that's what we've been told to talk about all this time. So, what do you think? Like, how are ways that we can educate people, especially because like a lot of people just they don't really think about this, and in the school we aren't really taught, and we don't have a platform to talk about this, and going through live streams like this where people have to especially go and look out for them, sometimes they can tell. So how do we engage people who are not really into like this environmental scene?
Okay, that's a very good question. Okay, so when we talk about educating people, what we have to do is find something that is actually affecting them. Okay, so what I talked to you guys earlier about was me. I don't necessarily feel the effects of climate crisis, but me as a person, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a scientist, and what I wanted to happen was that I want to talk to people about science in such a way that science is not shocking or something that's highfalutin or something that they could not understand. And one of the things that made me go into climate activism and being an environmentalist is that around, I think it was around 2017, wherein there's a lot of climate change deniers popping out all over the world. So, me as a person that wants to communicate science to people, this is something that's a red flag for me. I do not want people to think that climate change is not real. Okay, so that's what happened to me personally. I found the red flag uh, in the things that I am passionate about. So, what you guys can actually do in terms of educating people is actually learning what people are basically what they advocate for, or maybe things that they care about. So when they care, maybe they possibly care about food sustainability. You can talk to them about the climate crisis is actually reducing the sustainability of food all over the world, or maybe they're an advocate for cleaner transport instead of being smelling the smoke from all the cars we have yeah on the streets. Maybe advocating for bike lanes is something that they actually understand. So find something that they are passionate about and then connect that to climate. That's one of the things that you can actually do. That though happens on a personal level. So in the grand scheme of things, when we talk about systems, one of the demands that we are bringing this September 25, last yesterday, when we had our climate action in the Philippines, is that um, we want to expand climate education in schools. Okay, so how that happens is actually up to the government. So what we are advocating for and what we are trying to do with these are is actually talking to different government officials and telling them that, oh, we need to expand how we talk about climate in the basic schools, grade school, or yeah, basic schooling. We cannot talk about climate education in terms of reduce, reuse, recycle anymore. And if the Department of Education in the Philippines agrees to that, which we are actually quite hopeful because the Department of Education in the Philippines has been actually supportive of the different strikes that we are having, more and more teachers and more educators would actually try to incorporate that in the way that they teach climate change and global warming in the school. So yeah, maybe what you guys can actually do is try to talk to your government officials, try to talk to your Department of Education or that counterpart in your government to actually try to revise the curriculum in such a way that climate education is highlighted and it's not just boiling down to the very individualistic actions that has been persistent in the climate education all over the world.
Right. Thank you for that question. I think we have two questions from the chat now. So one of them from Rachel. She asks, if the government's main rhetoric is to advocate for individual action, how do we shift that rhetoric away from that into something that have wider impact, that things that truly matter?
All right. Yeah, that's actually a wonderful question. So, yeah, I've been talking about individualistic actions or individual actions earlier, and I told you guys that that is not enough. Okay, so let's talk about numbers. And these are the numbers that you actually have to remember and you have to inform more people about for them to understand that individual actions are very important, but they will not answer the climate crisis. They will not solve the climate crisis. So the first one is when we talk about emitters and the global carbon emissions that we have, only 100 companies are responsible for 71% of all the carbon emissions that we are having. So imagine that. So okay, we are talking about 100 companies. There are thousands more of companies that are not there. So thousands of companies that are not there. There's also the different industries that are not there, and then there's the individual actions. All of those comprise the 29%. Okay, so if we try to remove all of those, okay, so imagine this reality wherein we all have zero carbon emissions. Okay, that's unrealistic, but try to bear with me here. Let's just imagine a world where that is the reality. There's still those 100 companies that is polluting our world. 71% is still there. Okay, and the IPCC said that we should reduce our carbon emissions by half. So even if everyone tries to remove our individual carbon emissions, there's still those 100 companies with that 71%. Okay, so we cannot achieve the IPCC standard of cutting it by half. The other thing that we have to remember is when we talk about individual actions, the 10% richest people in the world, the 10% wealthiest, contribute to 50% of global carbon emissions, while the poorest 50% of the world only contributes around 10%. So this is a shocking number. Many people are actually thinking that, oh, if everyone does it, it's already okay. But we have to remember that the contributions of different people are actually very different as well. And if we look at those numbers I've mentioned earlier, unless you're part of the 10%, the 50%, let's say half of the world, the poorest 50% tries to remove all their carbon emissions, the emissions basically that is from the the individual contributions to carbon emissions will only be reduced by 10%. Okay, so that's the disparity when it comes to carbon emissions. And we have to educate more people about those numbers and those statistics that we can actually see now that, oh, we actually have to hold countries. Okay, so we should shift our actions into calling out those people, those companies that are actually in charge. Okay, those people who are contributing the most, they have to be more accountable than us individual peoples that are trying to reduce our carbon footprints to the very maximum that we can have.
All right, thank you for the answer. I think we have a very interesting question by Mutansia. I'm sorry if I pronounced your name wrongly. So he or she asks about how we can prevent groupthink arising to fighting climate change. Groupthink, like when people talk about decarbonizing transport, a lot of people would like to, a lot of activists might be hungover. They will bash like biofuels and hydrogen and actively promote electric vehicles, but we don't really think about the pollution due to the mining of batteries. So I think the question is that activists may tend to think that there is like a silver bullet, like one size fits all solution, and like a lot of people may just harp on this idea without thinking deeply about it. So how do we prevent activists, people in this sphere, from like um, from following the groupthink mentality?
All right. Yeah, that's actually a good question. And I want to answer that with education. Okay. When we educate each other and when we educate different people, we have to remember that there is no one size fits all solution. Okay. all solution to the climate crisis in there. We actually have different demands than people in other countries. So you guys in Singapore, when you try to draft your demands for your government or to the different companies, it may be different from the ones in the Philippines. Okay, so that's where climate education steps in once again. Okay, when we talk about activism isn't blind. We have to remember that. Activism, before we do a lot of research, a lot of discussion that goes on. So this webinar, this is one of the things that we can actually do to educate more and more people about different actions. So me, as a Filipino that is not from Singapore, and we have Singaporean audience right now, this is something that actually helps you guys see that, oh, this is what's happening in the Philippines. But this may not be exactly what you guys should do in Singapore. Okay? So a lot of research comes in there. So we have this term called social investigation and class analysis. Okay? We do that before we launch any campaign. So when we talk about social investigation, we have to look at, okay, who are the people that are involved? Who are the stakeholders? Who is being oppressed, quote unquote? Who are the oppressors? What is the reality of the environment that they are living in? Are they being struck by natural disaster activities that are actually amplifying or making these calamities so much worse? So the research part is very important because once you've done your research, then you can actually think and collaborate about what action you can do with your organization or with the alliances that you are part of. That's wherein the organization part of the arouse, organize, and mobilize pattern that you are doing comes in. So now that everyone has their own research, now we collaborate. Okay, is this thing the thing that we should do? Or is this one better? Okay, if this is we want to do, what are the possible consequences that this will have to the different stakeholders, to the environment, to the different people? Okay, and that's when we mobilize. After that, that's when we mobilize. Okay, so the specific pattern that I told you guys about, the arouse, organize, and mobilize, you guys can actually do that as well, for you guys to actually know what demands you are going to bring and what actions that you are going to do. So we can help you guys with that. If ever we can collaborate about, uh, possibly we can give comments to you guys on what we think. But ultimately, the decision is ultimately yours. When you are an activist, you have to remember that you should not follow the group mentality or the bandwagons that, okay, everyone is going against fossil fuel companies. That's what we should do too. But if fossil fuel companies aren't your biggest polluter in your area, or there's something more urgent in your area, that's the thing that you should focus on first. Okay, so there's this importance and urgency aspect to things that when we do campaigns, we have to look into which is more important and which is more urgent before we summarize the campaign calendars for the year or for the month or for the week.
Right. So thank you for that. I think we oh, yeah, right. So thank you for that. We do have one last question, which is how, in your experience, or at least in YACEAT's experience, how has the Philippines, at least how have your local communities been impacted by climate change? For example, just from what I know, the Philippines has been particularly hard hit by typhoons in recent years and among other natural disasters. So how has climate change impacted the Philippines in that way?
All right. Thank you so much for that question. So, yeah, going back to the Philippines, I talked about the natural disasters that are in the Philippines. So, yes, those disasters or those calamities are natural, but climate change is making things so much more frequent and so much worse. Okay. So when we talk about typhoons, the Philippines is that's normal for Filipinos, us being hit by heavy typhoons and strong rains. But what's happening right now is we are experiencing rains, torrential rains that are like unprecedented. These rains, these floodings, these storm surges, these tsunamis, these wildfires, all of these natural disasters that we are experiencing are actually being made worse because of the climate crisis. So, for example, in the Philippines, we have been hit recently with Typhoon Yolanda. Typhoon Yolanda happened a couple of years back, and that was a super strong storm, a super strong typhoon, wherein like a province was almost decimated and destroyed to the ground because of how strong and how powerful the storm was and the storm surges were. And in the Philippines as well, we are also hit by like okay, if there are Filipinos that are watching this, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, that is normal. We have typhoons and everything, but the Filipinos are resilient. That's why even if we have flooding in the Philippines, when we see a television camera, we still smile." But in reality, if you are part of the urban poor communities, if you are part of the rural people, people in the rural communities, you are actually hit very hard. The economic and the social aspect of the disasters that we are experiencing is very extreme in the sense that right now we are in a pandemic. So we have the COVID-19 pandemic plus the storms and typhoons that we are experiencing recently and currently. So imagine that hit to the poor people and to the people in far-flung communities. How can they bounce back from those? Okay, and we also have wildfires in the Philippines. So all over the world, there have been images and videos of wildfires, and that is not new to Filipinos as well, because we have wildfires in the Philippines. Um, but the problem there is, well, wildfires are again natural and they are normal, like typhoons. The problem right now is the climate crisis is making it worse. The droughts, the wildfires are persisting for so much longer than in what we had before, and like once again, the economic and social repercussions of these calamities have been extremely affecting the different peoples in our communities. So yeah, when we I can't actually give you guys specifics because it's very normal to us now. So yeah, basically extreme floods, extreme droughts, yeah, crops wilting, crops dying. Our farmers are hit especially with a double whammy because we have droughts in around March, and then at the latter time of the year we have extreme storms. So our farmers and our sustainability is hit extremely hard by this climate crisis because of how the climate crisis and these disasters are affecting our agricultural sector as well. So yeah, basically calamities are being so much worse right now because of the climate crisis.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your sharing. And I think we've learned a lot about how this has impacted your communities and a lot about the situation in the Philippines. And so thank you very much for your sharing. And I think we have all learned a lot about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you, Hong and Ming.
Stay safe, I guess. All right.
All right. So our next speaker is also already with us. So, hi. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay. Hello, my name is Andri. I'm from Trend Asia, a researcher from Trend Asia, organizations in Indonesia that focus on transforming the energy and development in Southeast Asia. And it's great pleasure to join the event with the Fridays for Future Singapore.
So, Chen is now Chen from activism. Yeah, I really can't get that acronym
Yeah,
right. So, Jen just shared with us how Philippines local communities are being impacted by climate change, specifically the increased frequency of such as wildfires and flooding typhoons. And could you maybe go into how some of the regions are
Hongyu and Min, I'm so sorry, but your voice is not quite clear and so far from the speaker, I think.
Okay. Are you able to hear us now? Sorry, I shall change. Are you able to hear us now?
Yeah.
All right, okay. So do you want to repeat the question? I'm so
Right.
sorry about
So basically, how are Indonesians, in your communities, affected by climate change, and yeah, the increased frequency of climate disasters as a result of climate change?
Okay. Thank you, you and Min. This question is very interesting to be answered. But Indonesia, as we know, is the biggest nations with a lot of island, and the impact of the climate change is very affected by the community, since we live a lot of since many people living in the near us coastal area, and Indonesia, one of the biggest, one of the fourth biggest coal producer, and a lot of coal fire power plant here, and that's one of the major factors that's speeding up the climate change in Indonesia. So can I share the slide, Min? And
yeah, sure.
yeah, sure. This is I prepare slide about the story about the impact of fire power plants that is one of the major factors of the climate change in Indonesia. Okay, uh, I will explain about the issues that coal as the cheapest energy source is actually a myth. You know, uh, Coal is one of the well-known factors that are contributing the worldwide gas emissions. Almost a half of worldwide emissions is contributed by the coal that speed up the climate change. And then many people argue that this source of energy is the cheapest one to be used as the main source of energy in a lot of countries, including the Indonesia. As your informations, for your informations, Indonesia is having only 2% of coal reserve in the world. And then, but in terms of the producing, they make fourth larger positions that contributing the worldwide amount and supply, and it used to be export and import for the energy sector. And coal as the cheapest energy source is actually a myth, because they never calculate the cost of productions in a good quality. For example, they never calculate the impact for the environment. They never calculate about the impact of the local community, and they never calculate the cost of production, for example, like reclamations and then a post mining process that they leave a lot of impact in the local community. I will explain it later, but this is a serious problem in Indonesia. And uh, as we are going to discuss about the climate change, we cannot deny that the climate change is a not natural process. It's more than a natural process. Rather than a natural process, a climate change is actually a human-made factors that contributing all the problem that related to the climate change. For example, we know that the coal-fired power plant is contributing of almost the half of worldwide emissions, but we still force the making new coal power plant, because we know that a lot of the business persons and a lot of politicians in many major countries in the world is having connections with the mining in the coal, and then they make a coal-fired power plant. So basically, they get the benefit from the upstream and the downstream, because they make the coal-fired power plant in the downstream, and then they make a coal extracting and then the coal mining in the upstream. So Singapore, I really interesting when the Fridays for Future Singapore invite me to join these discussions, and then to share about the what is the impact. But before we are going to the impact, I want to explain more about the context of the climate change. That also having a connections with the Singapore as a citizens and as a country. Singapore having a DBS Bank, and now DBS Bank is involved with the project in Java, the most populous island in the world, also in Indonesia. And then they are going to make a Java 9 and 10 project. And it will be, if the if this coal power plant built and operated, it will be added more than 2,000 gigawatts, 2,000 megawatts in Suralaya complex, that we know that it's a coal-fired power plant, the biggest coal-fired plant in Southeast Asia, and they're forcing the investment. Because why I call it forced investment? Because there is no justify for in terms of the economy, in terms of the impact of the community, and then in terms of the environmental benefit. I will, and if the DBS Bank, for example, involving in this project and with the Korean company and Indonesian company, this is hypocritical policy. Because if we are serious to tackle the climate change, never please transform the energy into the clean one. Because if it's not be happen, the energy will contribute to the climate change more and getting worse and affected by the community. Uh, this is the coal power plant having a serious impact from the upstream and downstream for several aspects like the environment, public health, and local community economy. Uh, the pollutions, and then the the coal power plant is ruining the local community economy, that being the fishermen, the net fishermen, and then the small seller near the coastal areas, and then ruining the environment because of the coal fire plant is having a pollutions, and then the air quality is getting worse, and it contributes to the greenhouse gases that seriously affected to the climate change. And I I I don't really like using the climate change. I'm more like into the climate crisis, because we it in fact that in Indonesia, for example, like Java, that the most populous island, is the crisis is very felt by the community, not only the nearest community, but all around the community near the coal power plant. So this is the map for the air quality in Java Island, and the project that I told you built in Indonesia, Java 910 project, a new coal power plant is built here, and this is the Jakarta, Indonesian's capital. And the Java is more 100 million people living here, is having a bad air quality, and the climate change is very affected. For example, the coastal area is getting bad in quality, and then this the sea level is getting high years by years. Uh, for the impact, I will explain later if there is a further questions, but any fish to be catch because of a lot of the coal ship, and then there is a coal power plant that use the coastal area as the area for operated, and the coral quality is very bad, and then they have to uh, use more cost to take any fish from the sea. And this is the serious one. In the other hand, we know that the coal power plant, in terms of the affecting the climate change, it also affecting the health of the community. There is a high level of pollutants near the fire power plant, and if the Java Coal 9 and 10 project built and allowed to operate it, there are a lot of premature deaths that going to be happen. And then the Banten province, for example, that will be built coal power plant, new coal power plant, is having a problem with the acute respiratory infections, because Banten province is the top 5 with high ARI in Indonesia. And then the area, for example, like specifically in Serang and Cilegon, as the nearest area of coal power plant, is being one of the highest number of acute respiratory infections with more than 40,000 cases. As for the first and initial informations for these discussions, Banten as the province is the biggest area that having a biggest number of the coal-fired power plant because it's near Jakarta, and then the government and a lot of investor from domestic and the foreign investor exploiting Banten for dirty energy project. So they have a more than 15 units of the coal power plant in Banten. That is the biggest, the number one of the uh, area or province that having a coal-fired power plant. But that's it at first. But now I'm opening to the next questions. Just okay.
Right. So I think that was a very interesting sharing, and I think the part about DBS funding the coal projects is yeah is so we just realized that like it's like people like from the richer countries that like DBS in Singapore going to other places investing in these coal plants for their own profits, but I think the local communities are affected, and it's not something we talk about here in Singapore, right?
Well, it's they technically do talk about it. It's just that you also have to dig through several hundred pages of financial documents to really understand what's going on. I think, yeah, I think it really misses out a lot of the actual impact that you mentioned. But one of the, so I'd like to know about one thing. If coal is bad for the health of the people, it's bad for the environment, and it's even bad for the economy, like as in that it's unsustainable, why do banks and governments still invest in it, as far as you can tell?
Okay, that's quite interesting. Banten as the area in Indonesia, this is for the case, but also the making of new coal power plant in Indonesia always follow up by the conflict in every regions. But in Banten, that is very unique. Suralaya coal-fired power plant is the oldest, one of the oldest coal power plant in Indonesia, and they were and they built that coal-fired power plant under the authoritarianism government. And at the first time, the Suralaya community is living, having a prosperity with living with the agricultures and then the fisheries, and then until the coal-fired power plant come and ruin all the quality of the area. For example, the water, the air quality, and then they no longer can use the agriculture or the fisher as the main source of income. That's the first explanations. So the people cannot resist at that time, and then it's gradually the people getting moved to the new kind of source of income. For example, like the coal power plant, working for coal power plant because of the quality of environment is very bad. But no, times by time, this will be justified for the government to make a more and more a coal power plant. In fact, the absorbance of the workers for the coal power plant is not that much. It's only, and the local economy is really affected, and some of the local cannot participate in the circle of the economy by that happen from the coal power plant. And then why the question is why the government keep investing on the coal that has a significant impact to the climate change and then significant impacts to the environment, and then to not having that much significant impact for the local economy. The question is because of the context. Indonesia is having a Indonesia is only having a 2% of the coal worldwide reserve. It's only for 11 positions in the world, but they are exploiting the coal and make Indonesia at the fourth positions of larger coals. So we know that a lot of countries in the world is avoiding the coal for energy source of main energy source. So Indonesia is keep asking the investor just in case to make a new coal power plant because of the demand, because the producing the coal that's already extract for from the Borneo, from the Sumatra should be absorbed in the industry. So they are asking the investor from the Korea, the Japan, the China, and even the Singapore to be involved in this project because of a lot of politicians, a lot of entrepreneur in Indonesia, a lot of oligarch in Indonesia is having connections. And the right side, they have a mining industry, and they have a mining permit. They extract the coal. And the other hand, they make a coal-fired power plant. So the question is, they have a benefit in these both sides. There is no significant impact and benefit for the people, but why they keep pushing it? Because there must be a party that really get benefit from this dirty energy, and a lot of people is already accused that this policy to make a coal that really dangerous for the climate and then the environment and then the health of the community is by design prepared because of the benefit to benefit a several party. For example, like what I call it like oligarchy for mining oligarchy and then the oligarchy of energy in Indonesia. So I think this is the complex by design, and they keep maintain this kind of problem because of if they change to the renewable energy, they're losing their benefit and they are losing the profit. So I think that's my answer for these questions.
Thank you for your answer. So so we've been talking about not investing in coal. So let's talk a bit more about renewables. Are renewables feasible? Is it something that can completely replace coal? Like some people would say, oh, but
Yeah.
we need coal, we need fossil fuels to generate our electricity. We are not ready for renewables yet. What do you think about this?
Yeah, uh, maybe probably that 10 years ago, we never imagined that the renewable energy prices and the cost of renewable energy is will be that cheap for now. It's already fallen more than 80%. And then, for example, in Indonesia, we have pot- a lot of potential of energy such as the solar and then the wind. But for example, for specifically in Banten, where I talk about the 9 and 10 project as the case, they have a 5,000 megawatt. It's more than enough to support the electricity in the local area, but only 0% to be used as the energy source in that area. So I think if we talk about the cost of the renewable energy is getting more cheap and the cheaper, and but the government still make the policy that not really provided a good climate for investment in renewable energy because of, for example, like renewable energy infrastructures and or elements or part of the renewable energy still categorized as the expensive part and then get a lot of tax if we get import. And this is the problem, one of the problem. And by design and by the policy, the renewable energy cannot be accelerate and contribute with the problem in the local community.
So thank you for that. So I think the fact is that like it's a lot of rich countries like Singapore investing in coal, in these dirty sources of energy, or other in other poorer countries. And I think for our viewers at home, this is something that maybe we should consider when in talking about climate change, in what we are doing to what we are doing in other countries, and also ties in with the whole overall theme of climate injustice, right? It's us pumping money for coal projects in other countries, and we feel the benefits and the profits, but people on the ground, they are the ones who are getting affected by all of the negative impacts of having a coal power plant on their backyard.
Yes. So, would you, I mean, you as an Indonesian working in the communities that are affected, would you have anything to say with, like, if you could talk to the policymakers who are funding these projects, who are making these projects possible, is there anything you would like to say to them, or anything you'd like to say to the public in the countries that are funding these projects, such as you mentioned before, South Korea, China, even Singapore?
Okay, thank you, Hongyu and Min. Climate change is actually a problem that need a comprehensive solutions. And if you are not having a solidarity and not having a comprehensive solutions, I mean, if the country is just doing their own things and not contact with the other and not connect with the other, and not having a partnership with the other, it means that climate change will still happen and having the impact for all the community around the world. For example, like this, a climate change that also speeded up by the power plant. Uh, it's for example like South Korea, for example like Japan, for example like China, for example like a Singapore that involved as a DBS that involved as the financial advisor for this project. Uh, it might be not built in your home or home country, but it put on your earth, it put on your world. We still live in the same place. Maybe, for example, like the pollution, the greenhouse gas is not having a nationality. If you build the coal power plant in Indonesia, does it only affect for the Indonesians, for the direct problem like the environment and then health impact? The health impact will be significantly felt by the local community. But in general, for example, the climate change, it might be affect the people around the world. So I think if you only stop making coal-fired plant, for example, like South Korea having a policy to stop the coal power plant, building the coal power plant in their home countries, but they're pumping up the money to Indonesia, it still not be a solution because you just you're just moving the problem, not solving the problem. And if, for example, like Singapore, as a developed countries and well known for the modern in technology, and the South Korea is also the same in Japan and something. And if you're just pumping up the money to the other countries like Indonesia, that's still developing, that's still asking for infestations from the other, does it not going to affect you in general? It will affect you in general. It will affect the community around the world because of, yeah, this is our world. It's not, it's maybe not in your hometown, but you build something that affect our world. We're still living on the same planet. So yeah, maybe as the community living here, we just protest for building the coal-fired plant near my hometown, near my nearest area. But let's gather and let's moving together and protest because they keep ruining our planet.
Thank you for that. I think it's a very powerful message that all of us here are in this together, even though like maybe on the front line is the poorer countries, but in the end we all live in the same earth. And I think that's a very powerful message and all of us should play our part too. Thank you so much to Andre for your sharing. I think we have learned a lot. Our viewers have learned a lot. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. So, as you mentioned, Singapore has to play its own part, and I think our previous speakers have covered that we as a relatively privileged country, we have the responsibility and the capability to play our role in averting the climate crisis. Now, our next speaker, Professor Winston Chow, is going to speak on what Singapore is actually doing to resolve the climate crisis in its own capacity.
Okay, thank you. I presume you all can hear me loud and clear, I hope.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Fridays for Future Singapore, for firstly organizing this event. It's a very important occasion to remind everybody that climate change, climate crisis, climate disruption is it is an existential crisis. Don't take it from me, take it from what Prime Minister Lee has said last year during his National Day rally. But the issue is, why should we care? And as my role as a sort of educator, I will just spend my 10 minutes allotted to me saying four things. First is, what does the science say? In my night job, my day job is educating, doing research in Singapore Management University. My night job instead is to work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, trying to get their next assessment report out by 2021-2022. And we are on course to have about, I'd say, 3,000 plus pages of the latest updates and assessments on climate science. But all this can be summarized in just 10 words, borrowing from Dr. John Cook, who's currently a researcher at George Mason University and one of the finest climate communicators around. Those 10 words can sum up everything the IPCC has said. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, there's hope. Okay, I'll repeat that again. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, but there's hope. You'll come across, and I think the previous speakers have pointed out, there will be climate contrarians, climate skeptics, climate deniers, whatever you call them. They will say the opposite, which is, it's not real, it's not us, experts disagree, it's not bad, and there's no hope. That's as far away from the actual truth of climate change, climate crisis, climate disruption that we have learned over the past 30 plus years of undertaking of climate science. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do we actually trust climate science on those first 8 words that I just mentioned? And in my classes, I try and teach the 3 C's of climate change. First is that the evidence is coherent. It's logical, it's evidence-based, it's undergone rigorous testing since Joseph Fourier first found out about how climate change, how the atmosphere can trap in radiation. So the science is more than 200 years old, and we base our knowledge on that. The second C is that it is consilient, and this word usually is not well, it doesn't come across very often in the literature, but it's a beautiful term. It showcases that the different scientific disciplines of, let's say, in the Singapore context, the physics, the chemistry, and the biology all converge towards a common conclusion that if the physical science doesn't make sense to you, the chemical science makes sense to you for climate change, and the biological science also makes sense. So it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle that all the pieces from these science disciplines fit together to give you that picture of climate change. What do I mean by that? I'll give you a quick example. We know that CO2 is one of the biggest gases that causes climate change. We know that CO2, when you dissolve it in water, it becomes carbonic acid, a weak acid. We know that when this CO2 precipitates out from the atmosphere, it ends up in the oceans. So logically, you should see that, hey, the oceans should become slightly more acidic because of all that carbon that is stored inside the oceans as a carbon sink. And all the evidence, from various marine-based observational platforms or sites close to the oceans show that your ocean pH is actually dropping, is becoming more acidic. So you can see the link there between the physics and the chemistry. So that builds on our knowledge and our confidence of science. And the third C is obviously the consensus from the IPCC reports, the consensus from the scientific discipline that arises from the evidence. It is not a predetermined political consensus, but it comes from the logical and evidence-based database that we have from scientific research into climate change. So that's the second thing. We can trust what climate change says in the first 8 words of that statement that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. But now on to the last 2 words. The third thing I wanted to say is that there's still hope, and far often than not, there's always that level of despair that can afflict people who investigate climate change, who are activists in climate change, who advocate for climate change action. But I want to point out that there is still hope, there is still time. I'm not going to say that there's a stark 10 years before we're all doomed by 2030, but that's not really the case. The case is that in our research, the IPCC, we do point out that there are policies to governments. We can't prescribe policies to governments, but we can show pathways that humanity can take as a global whole, a global commons that would focus upon climate resilience, which combines climate adaptation, which combines climate mitigation and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is something that governments have agreed to, and they do want us to point out, look, what are the major pathways that can be done to keep to a 1.5 or 2 degrees C world. These goals actually encompass several of the own goals that Fridays for Future have towards treating inequality, towards transitioning towards a fossil fuel-free future. There's a lot of attention towards climate justice. There's a lot of attention towards the importance of renewables. There's a lot of attention towards the importance of divestment from, like what the previous speaker said, the need to get away from fossil fuel investments in coal and in oil towards more renewable stuff. And for this last thing about hope, while science can provide information, very useful information, it can't answer everything. It only can provide information for all relevant stakeholders towards climate change to act upon. And this is where you need an additional set of C's rather than consensus, consilience, and coherence. These other sets of C's are towards action. So I will propose 3 other C's of climate action that hopefully can be taken forward by activists or climate advocates everywhere. The 4th C is communication. How do we communicate this scientific knowledge to every stakeholder, to the young and to the old, to the business community, to the governments, and so on and so forth, is critical. Translating this hope towards community action is very, very important. And that's why I think this webinar is so essential. Now on to the last thing I wanted to say, the 4th point, what can we do in Singapore? Unlike places where, shall we say, the COVID-19 response has been massively screwed up, such as the US, the UK, Brazil, and Australia, we have rather a more popular government. These 4 countries that I just mentioned, there's an unpopular government there that's also largely opposed to climate action. Thankfully, that's not really the case here in Singapore. That said, there's a limit to what we can do. We keep hearing the 0.11% of global carbon emissions that Singapore has for your scope 1 and scope 2, your direct emissions. It's also the subject of a lot of bingo cards. I know, like, oh God, the government is saying this again, and what do they mean by that? The sad thing is that you can't fight math, you can't fight the data. Even if we get to net zero, even if we remove away the 60 million tons of carbon equivalent emissions that we have by 2050 or before that, there's zero discernible influence in terms of temperature reductions around the world. Case in point, what Xi Jinping announced earlier this week, where he said we're going to commit, or China is going to commit to net zero by 2060. That reduction of 12 trillion tons, or was it 12 gigatons of CO2 rather than 50 million tons of CO2, like what Singapore has, that has a bigger impact on climate, on global temperatures in the future, rather than what we can do. So you can't fight that math. However, that argument is no excuse for inaction. All right, Singapore has to act accordingly. And why is that the case? I'm going to use a few concepts that I teach in my climate change classes. You probably have heard a lot about the tragedy of the commons, how carbon pollution of a shared commons, a shared the shared atmosphere we all live and breathe in, regardless of where we live in, is not taxed. It's an externality. It's something that has to be dealt with, and that's what the science has pointed out in a lot of research. But in terms of action for reducing emissions, there's another paradox that's more important. It's a prisoner's dilemma. We have to find out that cooperation amongst individuals, cooperation amongst governments and societies in terms of doing the right thing is required for the best possible outcome, is required to keep to the world, keep the world to a 1.5 degrees C threshold limit. So in that aspect, it's not the matter of the 50 million or 60 million tons of CO2 that we can save. It's how we can show we are doing the right thing and get others on board. I have no doubt that what Xi Jinping said this week will spur a lot of other countries into action. So if we can go on board with that, get this momentum at the governmental level to showcase that, we can, by our own actions, we can influence other cities, we can influence our regional neighbors as well. What we can do apart from the ramping up of solar and ramping up of affecting the behavioral action, we can do other sorts of things. We can manage our indirect virtual carbon emissions. Yes, we do have oil and gas industry. Yes, we do have a lot of building and construction and all that. But we also import a lot of carbon from our goods and services, our materials, and the transportation of this material, which some studies have pointed out could be up to 40% of the physical carbon emissions that we generate within our territorial boundaries. We can also manage our two large carbon intensive industries better. It's not just the oil and gas industry that we've been, that is featured prominently in Jurong Island, but also a lot of the information and communication tech that is burgeoning industry in Singapore. We're going to be a data center hub, and those data centers are power hungry. And the industry itself knows that in order to be sustainable, there has to be better ways of being more efficient, as well as to reduce that industrial carbon footprint as best as they can. The third thing is that businesses have to go to net zero. The sustainability argument has to also include what large and small corporates have to are doing in terms of their direct and indirect emissions. In terms of what the local, what Singapore's doing, I need to mention what Temasek Holdings has done. They're trying to get to net zero and trying to get in terms of both their direct operations and in their investment portfolios. But there are other things that can be prompted or can be done. Talking to industries to say, look, you need to divest. What's the point in investing in sunset industries like coal with stranded assets when your return of investment is negative, even with whatever governmental subsidies? There has to be standards, high environmental standards in operations. It's not in my discussions and engagements with the corporate world, the challenge is telling them, look, it's not so much an environmental sustainability argument, it's an economic sustainability argument. If you don't improve your practices, both your strategic and your operational practices, your competitors will, and you're going to lose your lunch. And that's the way of using the profit motive to persuade corporations to actually change their behavior towards a more sustainable end. I will conclude by pointing out that the third C that matters is cooperation. So the three C's of climate action: communication, building a community, and cooperation within the community. That's what matters in trying to get this climate crisis to something, or resolve this climate crisis in the years to come. Okay, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Right. So we'll be filling some questions for you. So you mentioned that the Singaporean government does, to an extent, consult the experts. I mean, they've already invested a lot in researching the impacts of climate change how it will affect Singapore. Obviously, they're also spending 100 billion to build defenses against rising sea levels, am I correct? Is that?
That's for the adaptation part.
Right.
When they're looking at how to resolve the issue of rising sea levels. But yeah, and it's probably going to be more than 100 billion, but that's besides the point.
All right. So the one thing we sort of noticed is this. There's a lot of rhetoric about how Singapore is sort of doing well and is a regional, if not global, climate leader. I mean, it's not. This isn't coming from me. It's coming from you can Google it. PM, yeah, right. But specifically, PM Lee said at a summit last year, a climate action summit last year, that Singapore is doing its fair share with regards to both adaptation and mitigation. I don't know. Do you think that's true? Do they have this sort of merit to the claim?
It's a relative argument. That's what I think. The bar is set low, admittedly, because when the Paris Agreement in 2015 was drawn up, it's bottom up. They didn't want to make the error that the Kyoto Agreement had, where all the decisions in terms of your emissions was top down. So each nation state was free to come up with what would be considered reasonable, or reasonable in terms of its action. But one thing about Paris is that your nationally determined contributions, the amount of CO2 emitted within your geographical boundaries, you are expected to ramp it up over time. The closer you get to 2030, the closer you get to 2050. So what I'll do an Obi-Wan Kenobi and say that what PM Lee said is probably true from his, or from a certain point of view, but the point is that compared to other nations, I guess the geopolitics is that they want to see how the large emitters, the Chinas, the Indias, the US and the EU, what will they do in terms of ramping up their own respective NDCs in the future, whether or not their own mitigation actions can improve upon what they suggested they can do during the time from Paris and subsequent Conference of Parties. So yes, maybe they think maybe Singapore is doing more than its fair share, but there is way more room for growth, and the time in terms of urgency is getting shorter and shorter. And given recent announcements, my hope is that the sort of bold declaration that Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean said earlier this year, that they would aim for net zero sometime soon after 2050, can be actually pulled forward. So it's up to them. We know that the government, in terms of its ethos, is to do something along the lines of under promise and over deliver. My hope, and without saying too much, my expressed hope is that they will keep to this over delivering and try and pull forward this horizon of net zero before the 2050 time limit that I think everybody around the world is hoping that will come to pass.
Right. So, so on that topic, you say that the Singaporean government is sort of looking for signals from other countries with regard, with basically the bigger polluters such as China, India, and the US. But my question then is, China, as you know, has recently committed to carbon neutral by 2060, correct?
Carbon neutral by 2060, yes.
Right. In the US, if I remember correctly, there were projections that if Biden wins the presidency, the US will go carbon neutral by like 2035. And if Trump wins 2050,
let's not talk about Trump winning. It's very depressing.
Oh, okay. Yes. We'll see how that goes.
Yes, fingers crossed. We worry about things that we can control. I guess
Yeah.
if the issue is wait, so what's the question? Is the question whether or not it matters in the long run, or?
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Like, we should be worrying about things that we can control.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So in that regard, I don't know. Would it be? Should we still say that Singapore should be taking the lead, like setting more ambitious
Yes,
goals?
yes. Undoubtedly, yes. Singapore should be more ambitious. It's not. It's while we wear different hats. If Singapore is a unique, an oddity in the sense that it can both be a city and a state at the same time. The thing that I would like to stress is that there's an opportunity for Singapore to take the lead, and we like to think of ourselves as punching above our weight. If the opportunity arises to showcase that, look, as a city, we are, in a unique environment. We are one of 2 or 3 major cities in the equatorial belt, which is we don't have tropical cyclones, we don't have major droughts or things like that afflict a lot of our neighbors or elsewhere. So we're rather fortunate to have that. But it's also this stability also allows us the chance to develop potential industries, potential solutions, but potential practices that can be implemented in other larger cities that are rapidly expanding around the world. There is hope for that, and if not just for the governmental aspect, but also for the private sector. I don't see why businesses here can take a stand in promoting, promoting ESG stuff, promoting sustainability stuff, promoting divestment in the future, and also the sort of applied solutions, your traffic management, the sort of ERP technology that has been exported elsewhere, the fact that we are going to remove all internal combustion engine transportation, private ICE engines by 2040, which is ahead of what the IPCC recommends is one of its pathways, which is the 2050 deadline. There are things that the management of these solutions, I hate to use the term uniquely Singapore, but there is a sort of way that Singapore does these sort of things that can provide good case studies for other cities elsewhere to learn and to apply. That's one of the things that I've been quite forthright in my commentaries and in my discussions with the powers that be, both in the public sector and in the private sector, in terms of focusing on these ideas as sort of ways to implement to keep your revenues up and also to become more sustainable and deal with the climate crisis worldwide.
So thank you for that. I think like we all know that Singapore's goals aren't exactly that high, and I think the climate action tracker says that if we continue with our what we are doing right now, I think we're on track to a world that's like 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher. So what concrete policies do you think the government can do to let us like be able to hit that 2 degrees goals? Do you think can you think of any concrete policies that we should start doing soon?
Okay. A few come to mind. First, there's no silver bullet. Like what other speakers before me have said, you can't just have one bullet and think that it'll solve everything. A range of policies have to be put into place. That's honest. First is target the big industries that are the major carbon polluters. We have to move away from natural gas sooner rather than later. I think the plan is there. The sort of stimulation towards investments in R&D are needed. There is potential for CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Hopefully that comes to pass sooner rather than later. I mean, the research is there. The challenges are in upscaling that to something that is profitable, sustainable in terms of profitability for the industry. Second is that renewables in terms of solar have to be put into place as soon as possible. There is a solar plan. It's more concrete than the East Coast plan, for one thing. What can be done is that you need to have a large chunk of energy supply directed to renewables from solar. And in terms of our geographical location, I think with the zero tide and zero wind influence towards renewables, and zero hydro and zero geothermal. Solar is probably the only way to go. It's also that technology, which I think previous speakers have pointed out, the cost per unit of electricity provided is plummeting, and it has the most potential. There's also hope that we can import in energy from a regional power grid that is primarily driven by renewables, either hydro or from solar elsewhere, or they get in the private sort of investment from Australia. There was that idea mooted that a solar farm in the northern territories of Australia could export energy to Singapore. So if you can replace the 90% of energy generated by natural gas today with a combination of local and regional sort of renewables, that would be a massive start. And I think the policy towards that end is also in play. A lot of my students, when I teach climate change, they mention nuclear. I am at this point still agnostic. There's still a lot of risk with nuclear in play, and I think the government has articulated that well. That's probably a discussion for another another day, whether or not nuclear is something useful for Singapore. Then what else? Don't focus so much on the behavioral sort of solutions. We, over the past 9 months, has it been? Yeah, about 9 months since COVID took effect. Emissions worldwide have dropped compared to last year by anywhere from 6 to 7%, even after the reawakening of industrial emissions worldwide, mostly from China. We are on course to have somewhat of a 4 or 5% reduction compared to last year. All this reduction is primarily driven by individual or collective individual action in not taking business trips or tourist trips elsewhere. It's the aviation and maritime sectors have taken a large hit. Emissions from there have dropped substantially. The individual action can't get you to the 1.5 or 2 degrees C world as much as structural solutions, policies that target the major emitters in the industry, in power generation, in agriculture, in the building and construction industry. And that's where the biggest potential for actually doing something can be done. And in Singapore's case, the building and construction industry, there's evidence that more sustainable practices for design, for construction, moving towards low emission, high efficiency, low emission construction practices and maintenance is in play. So what else? So I've talked about a sort of multitude of policies that cuts across different aspects of Singaporean society, Singaporean economic activities. If each industry does cooperate, if each industry realizes. Okay, hello, anyone there?
Hello.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
okay, good. We're still here. Good to see that.
I think I'm quite surprised to hear that there's actually a plan to move away from natural gases, because I think the rhetoric that we've been told all the time is that
not told.
yeah, I think right. Yeah, so actually I think among the 10 words you said just now, right, ending with there's hope. I think what you shared today really shows that there is a lot of hope. I guess I think a lot of us came into this movement like activism thinking that wow, there's so much things to do and like nobody's listening to us. But I think your sharing has like given us like I guess a roadmap on how and what Singapore can do. And I guess I guess there really is hope and there's things that we can do.
Good to hear that. I hope that, again, on the theme of hope, I'll be honest. I always, when I teach climate change, I always end up in the final, and in case some of my students are hearing, I always end my final lecture by answering the question, are we effed? And it has changed over time. When I first started teaching, I was very, sort of depressed and realized that, there's not much hope. But in recent times, because of the role of activists and the role of and in my own role when I go for the various IPCC meetings with my fellow authors and also with governmental delegates, the sort of words and actions that have taken place by youths worldwide, by people in the corporate world who realize and they listen to what you have to say, is quite significant. So it's not an issue of we're doomed or we're effed or climate doomers, so on and so forth. But I think that the tide is turning, and it has been rather sustained since 2018, when the the special report for 1.5 came out from the IPCC, and that spurred a lot of action and discussion. So what you guys do actually do make a difference. And I view my role as an educator and as a concerned parent is that making sure that the rhetoric is not empty, that is actually grounded in good science and good social science and good policy. And so as I say, if my students are listening, the answer is already there. We're not screwed just yet. There's still hope. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the sharing. All right.
Right. So next we're going to move on to the advocates that Winston has talked about. And for this, our facilitator for the upcoming panel discussion will be Rachel Tey, who is from Eco Youth Collective. So Rachel.
Thank you so much, Hongyu and Nguyen, for hosting the first half. And also want to shout out to all the audience who have tuned in so far. I hope the front part has been very meaningful and valuable for you. For me, it certainly has been quite content heavy. So we'll be taking a step back and changing our lenses on today's live stream. So what we covered previously was looking at regions from different Southeast Asian cities and countries, as well as looking at a bigger picture of Singapore. So now we're going to dive more into how activism has been like in terms of civic action on the ground before we move into our panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce Xiang Tian for our next 10-minute segment. So actually, Xiang Tian and I have been friends for pretty long in the environmental scene. And I'm sure if you are calling in, having been to green events in real life, you would have seen him as well. He is always dressed in a very iconic attire of a green shirt, a gray shirt, shorts, and slippers. And I'm sure he's wearing that at home right now and feeling very happy that he doesn't need to dress up for today's event. Xiang Tian will be giving us a short brief about what the climate activism scene has been like in Singapore recently, especially because many efforts have propped up on many different fronts. And we want to make that clear before we go into our panel discussion. So Xiang Tian, when you're ready.
Hello. Yeah, just give me a minute to share my screen. Okay. Yeah. So today I'll be talking a bit about the climate activism in Singapore. Yeah. But before I start, I'll just give like a short introduction myself. So my name is Xiang Tian. I'm the co-founder of Lepang in SG. We started off as an environmental calendar, but we evolved to run activities to raise action and awareness about different environmental issues. So like if you want to get in contact with us, you can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, or on our website, or email us. Okay, so today I'll just cover like a very short one on notable events, the government's engagement with civil society, and Singapore's plans on mitigation and adaptation. So first, notable events. Like last year, there was the SG Climate Rally. So it's actually quite interesting because it's the first climate rally in Hong Lim Park, and more than 2,000 people attended. And there's a lot of interest generated on climate for that. So I think it's also like the first time that you actually see climate signs being displayed publicly. So previously you see a lot of signs from other countries, but it's not really applicable in Singapore. And then next you have the online climate strikes. So it was organized by the Tingkat Heroes and the Weird and Wild, so they are Instagram accounts. I think there are about 300 submissions, and it was very interesting because they put pressure on businesses and the government, and they use this government hashtag like Climate Action SG. And it's quite funny because a lot of the posts that you see on this hashtag, right, actually are how do I put this? I guess more individual action. So there will be things like, oh, I recycled today, then hashtag climate action SG, or like, like, oh, I brought my metal straw out instead of using a plastic straw, then hashtag climate action SG. So yeah, it's quite interesting because if you go and scroll, you'll see a bunch of individual action, then suddenly like there's a bunch of all these posts. Yeah, and they kind of like took over the government hashtag for a while. So yeah. Then there are also some other things that happen. So like there was a university divestment campaigns. So there's fossil free UNUS and STAN, which try to pressure NUS to divest. And I don't think they managed to get NUS to divest, but they managed to find out more information about how much is invested in fossil fuels. Then there's also another group called NTU Divest that's quite recently formed. And they also managed to find out like how much NTU invests in fossil fuels. So I think there's a speaker on the panel later, Chu Yu. She's in STAN, so you can talk to her and find out more. Then there's also climate change negotiations workshops. So there's this person called Melissa Low. She's actually been to like many conference of parties. So there's the COP that happens once a year where all the countries get together and like talk about how they're gonna combat climate change. So Melissa has gone to COP for like many times, and like I think she realized that, oh, when you go to COP, right, it's all very new to you and you can get lost in the negotiations very quickly. So she came out with this climate change negotiation workshop to kind of like let people know what kind of like before you go, you get a crash course on what happens so that when you go there, you don't actually become lost. Yeah. Then also like there are people in Singapore who have been going to COP since at least 2008. I'm not sure if there have been people who went before that. Yeah. But most of the time people go as observers. So as an observer, you just like wear this badge, and depending on your badge, you get to go to different rooms. And in different rooms, they discuss different things. So interestingly, if you go to different rooms, you can see like, okay, which countries they are, trying to push for more action, which countries they are trying to like delay action, and they can argue over like all sorts of points. So like whether how a paragraph should be written, or like where a comma should be put, this kind of things, they can actually argue for really long. So a couple of people who have gone to COP have given speeches there. Like Lastrina, she gave a speech at COP21, and Amira, she gave a speech at COP15. So I think Lastrina is going to be on the panel later also. So you can Google her, but you can also ask her more questions later. Okay, next, government engagement with civil society. So government has been engaging with civil society for some time. So some of it is more visible, right? So like politicians going for environmental events like SG Climate Rally, you see Desmond Lee, you see Louis Ng, and they help. I guess they help to lend some support to the event, right? And show like, okay, this isn't like an anti-establishment event. And also it helps to show that they are concerned about climate change. But there's also other things like closed door engagements. So you see, I think this was with the National Climate Change Secretariat in November last year. So they were trying to talk to civil society organizations to kind of find out what we think, and like explain some of their rationale behind doing certain things. So I think they also met with us. When did they meet with us? Earlier this year, yeah. I think in about February, yeah, before the COVID lockdowns happened, right? So we met with them, then they explained to us, because they came out with this new enhanced nationally determined contribution, which is basically like Singapore's pledge to the Paris Agreement, right? On how we're gonna support the world to transit to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Yeah. So so I think in these engagements, they will explain to you, okay, the science says we have to hit net zero by 2050. We have to halve emissions by 2030. But why isn't Singapore doing that? And they explain. And like, okay, so maybe certain things like, why aren't we going 100% solar for Singapore? And like what some of the trade-offs are. Yeah. Then other than this National Climate Change Secretariat, actually, I think Muir, so back then, before before GE, it was the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources. Then now it's Ministry of Sustainability and Environment, right? But back then, the newer Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, they also engaged like environmental advocates every year at the start of the year to kind of like share what their upcoming plans are and like just check in with the environmental groups. Yeah. So it's not like they totally don't care or don't communicate with environmental people. Okay, then next, the government, they also do meetings with civil society at Conference of Parties. So here you can see Masagos and Vivian Balakrishnan, and then here you can see Lee Hsien Loong. So there's been interest for whichever like minister goes to COP. There's always some interest to talk to the people who come as well. So like you can talk to Lastrina about this later if you want, because like she has more experience on this lah. Okay. Now I'll just do a very quick sharing on our plans for mitigation and adaptation. So I read this off the National Climate Change Secretariat website on the enhanced nationally determined contribution. So you can see there's actually just two like very important numbers. So one is 65 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we want to peak at this level by 2030. But like I said earlier, you actually have to, we are actually supposed to halve our emissions by 2030. So it's a bit, I guess, a bit worrying that we'll be growing when we should be peaking at this year. And then the next figure is this one. We'll halve our emissions by 2050. But by 2050, we are supposed to be at net zero. Yeah. So you can also see in this infographic, they have some things on like what to do for mitigation and adaptation. And I think it's quite, actually the whole like mitigation adaptation thing is quite complicated because there's a lot of considerations. So for example, I think as of now, our power plants actually can supply 2 times of our peak demand now. So when you install more solar, you're not really displacing any new power plants. Yeah, and like going 100% solar also has like other considerations, right? Like, so if you have battery storage, then you have intermittency, then you have blackouts, which is something very destructive lah. Yeah. So I think something NCCS mentioned was also like Singapore can actually be 100% powered by solar if we covered 70% of our land area with solar panels. But we don't have that kind of land area to spare for solar panels. Yeah, that's why we can't go 100% solar yet. Yeah, and then also, okay, even though I think like a lot of people give the government a lot of pressure over their prioritization of adaptation over mitigation, or like their perceived prioritization, right? Adaptation is actually also very important lah, because without adaptation, we might not even be around in 2050. So like, can have things like floods, droughts, disruptions to our food supply, rising sea levels. All these can kill us before 2050 if we don't do any adaptation measures. So they are also very important. Just that I guess like as climate activists, we don't really like that focus on adaptation. Yeah. And I think that's about it. That's the end of my sharing.
Thank you so much, Xiang Tian, for that very informative presentation about what's up in Singapore right now. So with that, we'll move on forward to our panel discussion, and I'd like to invite Chu Yu and Lastrina to turn on their cameras to join us on the panel here. So what's going to happen is we are going to try and answer 3 questions today together. Oh, hi. Hi. So nice to see you all. Which is, firstly, why should we care? Secondly, what should we do? And lastly, what can I do as an individual? Hi, Minh also. So before we start on this conversation, I thought it would be nice if we could just go in a circle to introduce ourselves. But many of you might be wondering, like, who is this new face here? Who's me? Just thought I'll also introduce myself. My name is Rachel, and as Minh mentioned, I'm from Eco Youth Collective, but I was also told to share like a fun fact about myself, which I discovered today, which is that when I sneeze in multiples of 3 or 4. And I think my hypothesis is that when I sneeze in multiples of 4, like it's when I'm more tired. And my whole family like has sensitive nose and sensitive eyes. So when the haze really came to hit us, it was when we felt it the most. And my mom's eyes were like tear up when there's haze. So like, I used to joke that she was like our haze indicator. So like, oh, it's coming. And I think like when I was younger, like not as involved in the environment, it was when I experienced in a very mild sense, like firsthand of what environmental crisis could potentially look like in a smaller scale. And I think that was when I began my environmental journey sometime later on in school. And afterwards, I had the opportunity to join Xiang Tian at Nepal and SG to volunteer with them. And actually, during the lockdown, I began my own organization for a group of friends called Eco Youth Collective. So we aim to bring together pre-tertiary environmental groups and youths to kind of network with each other, provide support, share resources, and also gain mentorship. Because we understand that environmental action starting with and from schools can be very, very impactful. So I'm very humble and honored to be with the panel here today. They're kind of like my senpais, people that mean space, people that I kind of like meet at events and really look up to. So maybe we could go in a circle and introduce yourselves, where you're from, what is your favorite like animal or your favorite natural element, like what do you like about the environment or nature a lot? So Minh was giving me a very enthusiastic face, so I think he can start first.
Wow, okay. I'm not sure that's enthusiasm, but all right. So I'm Minh. As I mentioned before, I'm the co-founder of Fridays for Future Singapore. And how we started, well, it's not so much started as much as Jamin, our original, like our first founder, she did a school strike in earlier March, and then she posted about it, and then people just started joining through that. As for fun facts about me, I guess. My favorite element, let's see, is fire considered an element?
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, if you think about it, if that's all we're gonna be experiencing for the next few, decades, I should probably get used to it, right? So, yeah, I'll go with fire because that's what we'll be having for quite a while. Oh no, maybe water. That's better for Singapore, right? That's probably what Singapore will be experiencing more of. So yeah, water. So Fridays for Future Singapore, what we do is, well, at least before the COVID-19 restrictions, that is, we hold demonstrations and we try to engage students on climate change and climate action, because as others have mentioned before, youth are the ones that are going to be the most impacted by climate change. And in Singapore, there's a sense that if you want to make change, you should first basically work your way through your career and then go up the ranks of government and so on and so forth. But the thing about Fridays for Future is we don't really think that there's that much time left, in that projections are that we need to be carbon neutral by 2050. And we know that even based on current commitments, that's probably not going to happen. So yeah, we want to demonstrate, we want to rally people towards action now. And we hope to add to climate discourse in that way, just by showing that the youth really do care about climate change, not just the youth, but the people around them, their parents, teachers, so on and so forth. So yeah.
Thanks, Minh, for that. When you mentioned about fire and water, I was reminded of Lastrina's background, and it's very coincidentally the same as Prof Chow's background. So maybe Lastrina, you want to tell us more about yourself and where you're from?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks to Fridays for the Future for getting me to participate in the panel today. So yeah, my background and Prof Winston Chow, I think we've been using this for fun to raise awareness about climate change. So maybe to keep this part short, a quick introduction about myself and one fun fact. So a quick introduction about myself. I'm a co-founder of Singapore Youth for Climate Action. It's a platform for Singapore residents to join hands on taking climate action. And we do things like organizing learning workshops, for people to learn more about climate change. We do things like participating in focus group discussions to provide our inputs directly to decision makers. So that's a bit about me and a bit about SYCA. But maybe also at this point, I can share with you a bit of like the personal reason why I think I'm involved in these things. I would say from a more personal point of view, is that my family's quite rooted to the islands. So like from the paternal side of the family, like the islands in Indonesia, my dad was born on Lazarus Island in Singapore. I mean, previously it was known as Pulau Sekijang Pelepah. And I think like just growing up, having that sort of affinity with the islands just made me a bit more aware of what's happening in our surrounding areas, not just in Singapore, but also beyond, like Southeast Asia in general. A lot of people, I mean, we have more than 600 million people, right? And a lot of us are living in coastal areas, on low-lying areas. So like, to me, I kind of have that, I feel like I have that affinity and also like that familiarity with what other people have to go through. And yeah, long story short, it somehow, I mean, we can discuss this later, but somehow that led me to start SYCA in 2015 with a couple of friends. One fun fact about me, maybe I can focus on one fun fact. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I can pretty much run on 90 minutes sleeping cycle. So I do like 90 minutes or 3 hours and I can survive on that. I don't really need 8 hours. So yeah, one fun fact about me. Yeah.
Ooh, I would love that. It's like a superpower these days. Thanks for sharing, Lastrina. Chu Yu, are you ready? Hi.
Hello, I'm Chu Yu. I'm a year. Oh my gosh, sorry, the traffic. If y'all can hear it. Okay, well, how apt the timing. But yeah, anyway, I'm Chu Yu. I'm a year 3 global studies and geography student from NUS, and I run an organization called Students Taking Action for NUS to Divest. So it's the main like divestment group in NUS, and we work with fossil free Yale NUS to encourage the NUS management to divest from fossil fuels. Yeah. So what we do is mainly engaging with the investment office in NUS, as well as educating students about divestment. We also work with other universities for the Singapore's divestment movement as well. Yeah. So what my favorite animal, I think it would be a rabbit. I guess it helps to have like, to think of like a cute animal in light of whatever is happening in the world right now, because I think it kind of gets depressing very quickly. So yeah, and one fun fact about me, I used to write Chinese poetry, but after getting more involved in the environmental world, I stopped doing it. It's a trade-off, but I think like to me personally, I feel it's more meaningful. Yes.
Or you could write Chinese poetry about the environment. Win-win. But thank you for sharing. Last but not least, there's Xiang Tian, who already talked a lot, but he can still introduce himself and tell us what's his favorite animal.
Oh, okay. So yeah, my name is Xiang Tian. Fun fact is, well, I have worked with Rachel, Lastrina, and Chu Yu before. Yeah, on like different environmental stuff. Actually, all like Lepak Energy. Because yeah, actually Lastrina's my other Lepak Energy co-founder actually. Yeah. So we started this together in January 2016. It was quite strange because we were just having like dinner one day. Then I think we were talking about something else. Then we were like, why don't we just start an environmental calendar? And we did that in 3 days. And then after that, we realized that running a calendar is very boring because it's just, unpaid admin work. So we were like, let's organize some like more fun, meaningful events. So that's how like Lepak and SG kind of got started. Okay, wait, my favorite animal, right? I'm gonna say this is this crab called the hermit. No, not the hermit crab. The fiddler crab. So this fiddler crab is it's quite cute. The males have like one big claw and one small claw. So basically, like the small claw is for eating, right? Then the big claw is like for showing off and attracting mates. So you can see them in, I think, like Pasir Ris, Pulau Ubin. So when it's like mating season, you can see like a lot of them just run out and they start waving their claws and like fighting each other. It's very cute. So that's my favorite animal. Yep.
Nice, thanks for sharing, Xiang Tian. Also a quick plug, if you are kind of new to the environmental scene and looking for events to go to, you can head on to the Lepak and SG Instagram or website to look for the calendar of events that are happening now. So if we were to move on to the panel itself, I think a lot of discussion in the first 1 hour or so, 2 hours of our live stream was about the climate crisis. We'd like to kind of ground this discussion more in the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis as well, because that's kind of what's on everyone's minds right now. Even when we leave the house, we have to make sure that we wear a mask, and I always forget. So I'm always constantly reminded that this is real and this is happening to varying extents to different people around the world. So I think the first thing that I wanted to ask is, if the COVID crisis is something that is so prominent in so many people's minds, it's the buzz on the internet and on newspapers, why should we still care about the climate crisis? And if it feels like what Minh shared, like we are doomed for fire anyways, why should we still continue to care, and where is that hope coming from?
I mean, I think I would start off by challenging the idea that the message we should be getting is we should be focusing on COVID and nothing else. Like, yes, you can interpret it that way, in the sense that, COVID recovery means we have to get the jobs back, we have to get the economy moving again. And that is, I believe that is the plan that Singapore is going with, but other countries can also adopt what people are calling a green transition or a green recovery. In that after this crisis, we need to build back up in a way that pays attention to the other crisis. And if you really think about it, there are a lot of similarities between COVID and the way that COVID is being handled, as well as compared with climate change. I mean, if anything, I think that what's happening with COVID-19, us liking to make fun of America for, not wearing masks, us wanting to try to prove ourselves the leader in being able to handle COVID-19. Well, that was back in April, but still, us handling this crisis should sort of be a wake-up call to what happens to the importance of preventing a crisis versus, let's say, desperately trying to scramble to treat the effects of the crisis when it happens. So, for example, you might ask why climate activism, climate advocacy is important now, but you could have just easily asked why migrant worker rights, why migrant worker living conditions were important in, let's say, January 2020, right? If someone held up a sign and said that, oh, migrant workers should be treated better, they should have better living conditions, then people are still going to say, well, what about the economy? What about the costs that consumers have to bear? So in that sense, I think that if anything, COVID should prove a reminder that crises have to be prevented and not just treated. Yeah.
So I think for me, how I would like to respond to this question that COVID is happening now, why should we still care about the climate crisis? I think maybe for me to put things into perspective is that, I mean, first and foremost, let's acknowledge that both COVID and climate crisis, I mean, these are critical issues for humankind right now. However, I think for me that differentiating factor is that one can still, we're at this stage where we can still prevent the spread of COVID-19 and we know how to manage it step by step. In comparison to what's happening with the climate crisis, the situation is a bit more complex. The impacts have been felt for some time now, and it's really hard to say whether we can really address this in a way that everyone would want to address it and solve it 100%. So I guess in terms of the complexity of the problems, it's different. And in terms of the impacts on human, it's also different as well. I mean, with COVID, it's quite straightforward, right? Like if you get infected, it's either you recover or the other option. With climate crisis, it's a bit more complex and you get impacted in various ways. And for me, in terms of the impacts for Singapore and also for Southeast Asia region in general, I think we would be most hit by the rising sea levels, and for Singapore, the food supply. So rising sea levels, as I mentioned just now, it's because lots of us are living on coastal or low-lying areas. And with food security, I mean, for Singapore's context, because we import 90% of our food supply, I know like a lot has been mentioned the past 2 years, like, Singapore is investing in like technology and we're growing our own food. We are investing or we're exploring alternatives. But like to me, at the end of the day, like for now, like the number is quite clear that we are importing 90% of our food supply, and that still suggests that there's that element of insecurity. And with the food hoarding that happened because of COVID-19, like isn't that sort of a preparation, or like it sort of gives us an imagination of what could happen if climate crisis were to impact us, and impact us not just for like 1 month, 2 months, right, but we are talking about like 5 years, 10 years kind of thing. And so like for me, that's why like at the back of my head, like although these two issues are like happening now and it should be tackled, but like I think more emphasis could still be put on handling the climate crisis.
I think I'll also be curious to find out then, how would you all respond to people who say that, okay, let's settle the COVID crisis first, and when we are done with that, we take a breather, then we move on to what's next?
I think, sorry. Okay, I think both like crises can be kind of tackled together at the same time. Because I think like there's this like conception that the COVID crisis needs solutions that will take out resources, and then like that's why there may be less that will be diverted to the climate crisis for now. That's for the time being at least. But like, I think they can be really combined. Like if I'm not sure whether you guys have read like articles, and like this term called building back better will be something that will pop up quite frequently. So like in this in essence, like it's advocating for solutions that build back the economy in a more sustainable way. Yeah. Then like for instance, like for like some people have been thinking about how we can help the like airlines to actually build back better in light of the COVID crisis. So like, how can we like make air travel more sustainable, or like whether there can be alternatives to air travel that will be an alternative source of revenue for these companies in like a future where air travel may be less emphasized upon, things like that. So I think like, yeah, really both crises can be tackled together.
Okay, I was gonna say, actually the climate crisis makes the COVID crisis worse. And if you take steps to reduce like environmental impact, you can actually prevent future pandemics as well. Yeah. So think for example, like for us, because we don't really experience very bad natural disasters. So it's okay, right? When we have rain, if you have a flash flood, it disappears in like 5 hours or something. But I think in other countries, because of the climate crisis, the weather has become more wild. So they start to see things like flooding happening more regularly. And when it floods, it's not like, Orchard Road flood, then like we can't go shopping for a day. It's like their houses get washed off, so they're homeless. Or the water goes into their house up to, maybe like their waist. So there's no way they can live in there, and they have to move out and go to live in a temporary shelter until the water subsides. So when you cram a lot of people into a small space, because it's a temporary shelter, right? And then like if one of them has COVID, then of course it will spread very easily through the entire shelter area. So in a sense, you can say like the impact of the climate crisis actually makes COVID-19 spread more rapidly in certain areas. And then also like I think a lot of diseases have been jumping from wild animals to humans, and one part of that is because of deforestation, as well as like the wildlife trade. So if we like deforestation also contributes to climate change. So if you stop deforestation, it could reduce the amount of diseases that jump to humans, as well as help mitigate climate change. So that's my take.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing. I think we're also transitioning a little bit to the second question. So upon looking at how the world has tackled the COVID crisis, what kind of insights can we draw when we want to think about how can we next combat the climate crisis?
I think drastic action is possible if people really feel like, or like not if people, but if like people in power feel like drastic action has been taken, it can be taken. So like, for example, the lockdown is something that we wouldn't imagine was possible like last year, right? But once you have the pandemic and all these kind of things that would seem impossible previously become possible. So I think like, in the same vein, if people in power see that the climate crisis is something that's really happening now, and it's something that we have to take drastic action to mitigate, then they could do something very, very fast if they wanted to. So like, it's not like, even if they recognize that something has to be done, they can't do anything about it. They can, because they have shown it during this COVID-19 crisis.
I think for me, like the way how I'm interpreting this is like what can we learn from how we are addressing the COVID situation and then replicate that to how we're handling climate crisis, right? I think like one thing stood out for me, which is how the Singapore government is utilizing social media to raise awareness and tell people what to do. So like for me personally, I'm subscribed to the WhatsApp notification service over Telegram and WhatsApp. Oh yeah, so subscribing to the same thing but over 2 platforms. So I receive the same messages daily. And for me, I mean, psychologically, I just, I'm more aware about COVID. I know what's happening. And then they have all these numbers about, how many people are affected, etc. So like for me, if, in the ideal situation, I would like to also then replicate this to how we're handling the climate crisis, right? So just to, also acknowledge, I know there's lots of things going on, and like MSE, NEA, PUB, and all these other like social media pages, they do talk about climate change. But in terms of engagement, you need the user to be on your page for them to receive the news, right? But if they were to have a subscription notice of sort, then it's just easier for them to access the news, and psychologically it's there. I also would like to acknowledge that there are Telegram group chats which sometimes do talk about all these like climate initiatives or like some support group kind of services. So there are Telegram groups like that, but I'm thinking more of like a nationwide initiative where you just talk about it and you just get people to subscribe. And I think in the long run, like it just preps people mentally for the climate crisis and push more urgency to the individual to acknowledge that this is happening and we need to do something about it.
Yeah. To add on to Lastrina's point, I think that one important difference between the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis is that COVID-19 is much more, I guess, individual than the climate crisis. So, for example, like Rachel said earlier, if she forgets to bring a mask when she goes outside, then she's reminded of that, and it's also kind of against the law to not wear a mask outside. And that's a tangible thing that you can really do to not contribute to the crisis and also not get sick yourself. So in that sense, the COVID-19 crisis is much more personal than the climate crisis. I mean, for example, if I were to say to an average Singaporean that, oh, the climate crisis is gonna get really bad and, you know, cause all these problems that are similar to COVID-19, I guess they can sort of intellectually imagine what that means, you know, like these are gonna be bad things, but it's not as immediate as, oh, if you don't wear a mask, you're gonna get sick. If you don't follow these procedures, you're gonna get sick. And people know what being sick is like, right? They don't know what being a climate refugee means. They don't know what all the, like having your house actually be flooded, what that means. So yeah, I would say that to really get the buy-in of the average person, the average member of the public, you kind of have to make it more personal in that sense. If not, it's just going to be like what Winston Chow said earlier. It's going to be a tragedy of the commons where people kind of know it's a problem, but they're not going to go out of their way to sort of do anything. And in any case, doing anything is like, there's a much higher barrier to entry, right? Wearing a mask versus conducting activism or writing a petition or even having to learn about climate change. So yeah, I would say to really get the public to mobilize behind a crisis, it needs to be sort of brought closer to them in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think building onto like all the speakers, it's really important for people to be educated about what's happening around, like in terms of the climate crisis, because I think climate change is a very broad topic, and like when people think climate change as this big, huge, like ball of there's a crisis, like it's a bit easier to like feel helpless. I guess like if we have like more bite-sized information, like through like Telegram groups or social media, it might be better. And like and also to facilitate this education, like what Minh said, it's very important to make the content more personal. So like this will be for individual action. I guess like beyond individual action, it's also important to consider systemic ones as well. Like so beyond, like after getting information like about being educated yourself about the climate crisis and like spreading the word through social media and like relating it to other people in terms of how we can like make our own lifestyles more sustainable, then we can start thinking about how we can like go beyond our individual lifestyle changes into like bigger ones, like maybe signing, like organizing petitions to like change certain policies that may be more, that may have like more wide-ranging effects on like in terms of ameliorating crisis. For instance, like there was this online petition suggestion form about the like Singapore Airlines like recent controversial turn of events. So I think that's one form of like stepping beyond the individual action in terms of how we can help crises, like in terms of like climate crisis as well as COVID at the same time. Yeah.
Nice, thank you so much for sharing. I think really helped us to shed light on organizations out there or individuals. If we were to spread the word in our own ways, how can we go about doing that? But I was thinking perhaps we could zoom out a little bit more. I think Chu Yu hinted when she was sharing about some systemic changes and the direction that our green recovery can look like. So I think there has recently been a lot of talk about the COVID recovery task force and how we're working towards making a green and just transition towards like a so-called new normal. So I think wanted to bring together the expertise of each of you from your own organizations. How do you all feel like a Singapore green recovery will look like? So I think it's a lot of frustration out there, right? Because we are very familiar with like the individual, like I have to bring my own cup or I have to not use a straw. But in a bigger picture sense of things, how do you all feel like things will and can change? Difficult question.
I think
Yeah,
that's a
difficult
really
question.
like big question. It's like, yeah, I guess like to work towards a green recovery, it may help if we break it down, like we identify our own capacities first, like what expertise do we have, like what networks do we have, what can we leverage on, and then we can think about how we can leverage on these like resources, /networks, /expertise to contribute towards the green recovery in a way. Yeah, I guess like there's no one solution to. I think like everyone can contribute differently. So yeah, like for instance, as a student, I guess green recovery, we may not be able to like we may not have as much like networks, like professional networks that may, like for example, like linking out with a company for more like cleaner energy or like stuff like that for your own building, like your company's building is sort of like big scale like network. But like at least like we can educate ourselves and like learn more about what we can do, consider careers that may be able to contribute towards this green recovery in a sense. Yeah.
I was thinking more like Rachel was saying like more big picture, right? So I was thinking I mean like if you look at what's the most impact Singapore has, or like what's the worst emitter in Singapore? It's the industry, and then like specifically it's the petrochemicals industry, right? So it's kind of like if Singapore's moving towards a green recovery, then maybe the future after this would have a smaller percentage or have no petrochemicals at all, right? Because I think like what petrochemicals got hit quite badly during this COVID, because like what the oil prices crashed quite badly, and then there's like no space to store the oil that they are extracting. So it's not like very profitable anymore. So I mean like if you're looking at a green recovery, then it's what can we cut from our economy, and what can we shift towards, right? Yeah. So I think we can try to cut the more pollutive industries like petrochems. Aviation's a bit hard, right? Because like Singapore spent a lot of effort to build ourselves up into an aviation hub. But then if you were to say like, green recovery and COVID makes aviation not viable anymore, then like how can we cut it when we've already sunk so much effort into it lah? Yeah. So actually, actually I'm not very sure what else we can cut, or like what areas we can go into. Yeah, but I think Singapore has committed quite a sum of money into like R&D for renewables as well as climate science. So like as part of like a green recovery, we should definitely move towards that kind of stuff rather than trying to get petrochems and aviation back to where they were before the pandemic hit.
I think for me, like in terms of how might a green recovery look like for Singapore? I mean, there are several commentary pieces out there already, but for me, something that stands out is this element of people in the green recovery process. So the people subgroups that I'm thinking about, there's two. So one is in terms of the leadership on the task force, and then the other one is like people in terms of like the individual citizens. So with regards to the first one, on the kind of leadership or the kind of task force we need to lead us through this green recovery and like to, you know, like they always say, like emerge stronger, right, post-COVID. I mean, something that climate conversations has brought up the past couple of months is that they questioned, or not they questioned, but you know, they highlighted that there is a need to strengthen the task force to make it more representative of our society. So they said stuff like, you know, we should include more members from the people sector, people who are, you know, from vulnerable groups, more businesses which are representative of a climate safe future into the task force, right? So I think these are things that we should push for when we talk about a green recovery, like what can that task force and leadership look like, right? And I think as regular citizens, like I think we should also question and not be satisfied easily with the kind of task force we have, right? So as citizens, we can also, like, you know, write in and ask questions like, oh, how were the members of the task force identified? What's their terms of reference? Is it possible to add in more members in the next cycle, for example? I think these are questions that regular citizens can also write in and ask and make that leadership team or task force team more aware, so that in the working process towards a green recovery system, it perhaps, you know, can be a bit more solid, or it could be enhanced with more diverse views. So that's one. And then green recovery in terms of like what individual citizens can do. So this one I'm thinking with the context that Singapore, I think last month announced that we're projecting we're going to create something like 55,000 jobs in the next 10 years, which to me sounds like a great number, but like how actually can we get there, and like get there in the sense like we don't really like have to depend on the government all the time. So I think there's also the element of what the individual citizens can do. So what we can do, I think there's several things, right? Like continually upgrade ourselves and maybe like sign up for classes like sustainability reporting classes. There's a few providers out there. Do things like maybe now in Singapore, like being agile is a big thing, and like agility in the business concept, right? So maybe also like upgrade yourselves through those kinds of business courses, and then get yourselves into the private sector and leverage on that, and then slowly start to push for sustainability initiatives within the private sector if the company hasn't already done so. So I think like individually there's a lot of opportunities for people to tap on, like improve ourselves, and then like find those sort of like entryways into other organizations and see how we can push forth the sustainability or green recovery agenda. So yeah, so for me, I feel like there's lots of opportunity and lots of commentaries out there, but like what I would like to focus on is on this like people aspect of the green recovery process.
Nice, thank you so much. I think our conversation is also going towards the final question, which is us as our youths who are tuning into the live stream today, what are the actionables that they can do? So I know that Chu Yu mentioned looking at your own community and seeing how you can add in that green element into it, and Lastrina also, especially in terms of your future job career prospects. So maybe the last 2 or 3 responses we can tap a little bit more onto what kind of calls to action would you all like to leave our audience with today?
I can start. I would say, like, if you are interested in, or like, no, not if you are interested, if you are concerned about the climate crisis, I think the first thing to do is actually to find out more about what's happening, right? So like go for events, so you can check them out on the Lepak Energy calendar. But also like do your own readings of like what scientists are writing, what governments are saying, and then yeah, and also I guess learn more about the local context that you are at. So like if you're Singapore, learn more about like Singapore's context, and you know, yeah, use all these information to paint yourself a picture of what the world looks like, and then from there you can try and see like if there's any groups that you would like to join, or anything that you yourself want to do, then you can slowly start to do that kind of stuff. Yeah, but like learning more and knowing the context is very, very important.
Thank you, Xiang Tian.
Maybe I can share next. So I think for me, like in terms of the next steps, right, and what individuals can do, I think like as and I'm just saying this, talking to people who are new to this, right? So like the way I think it is, think about the 3 steps of a human-centered design process, like to inspire, ideate, and implement. So I think just to keep it simple, right? So like the inspiration phase, like what Xiang Tian mentioned, try to get to know what's going on in Singapore. But also I think to add on to that, try to talk to people and learn what they are doing. And I think there's many inspirational figures out there. And lots of people are doing good work, but maybe I can also at this point highlight 2 that I think are doing great work in Singapore. In terms of like they're not only doing advocacy work, but I think like they analyze the impact of their work a lot, and I think that's something that people also need to take note of and see how we can improve on our own initiatives. So like in this inspiration phase, like 2 figures that I think people should look into is Samantha Tien, who runs Sustainable, and she recently did the cleanups at East Coast Beach, right? And then there's also Lee Seng from Green Nudge. So I mean, he started off with a simple concept, but I think now he's expanding to other activities. But basically with these 2 and what they're doing with their organizations, I feel like you can really see the tangible outcomes of their work. And it's just, to me, like it's important to find not only inspirational stories, but like inspirational stories of tangible outcomes, which would motivate you to do something more or to do something about it. So inspiration, ideation, I think like each and every one of us has tons of ideas we want to run through. I think it's important to just brainstorm and then identify things that we really want to work on. And how we can do that is maybe just sit down and ask ourselves, what is that one superpower you have which you want to use to then work on something and address the climate issue? So like for me, if you look into my profile, like I focus on advocacy because I know my strength is in events organizing and a bit of people management. So like to me, that's how I do things, right? But then there's other people who are good with maybe science and they look into data and they do work that's mostly like science and data related. And it's just, to me, it's like just having different individuals and different skill sets and strengths and trying to do something to just better with what's happening in the world. And that's okay, right? There's no right or wrong answer to this. And the third part is in terms of implementation. So I think like with whatever ideas we have in mind, just take that idea a step forward and go and tap on like various funds and grants we have in Singapore. I mean, there's funds from National Youth Council, from NEA, now under MUA or under MSE, you have the SG Eco Office Fund. There's also fund from private sectors, from the social sectors. So, I mean, I guess in Singapore's context, these are the financial/resource pool is quite big. So I think it's then important to tap on these things and just run our ideas and see how we can implement them to help shape a better Singapore. Yeah, that's it from my end.
Nice. Thank you so much, Lastrina. I really like that we ended on this very empowering and inspiring note. I think it's important to remember that each individual, we are standing in the middle of overlapping circles, right, of our own skills, what we're interested in, as well as communities that we're part of, and being able to add that green touch or thinking about sustainability while we are in these communities with the tools that we have is the first way or the first step we can take when we want to work towards environmental action. So thank you so much, panelists, for your time today. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. I think I really enjoyed the discussion. We went from talking about the backdrop of the COVID crisis, what it tells us about the climate crisis, what can we learn from it, and then finally concluding with what our viewers today can take home with. So with that, I would invite you all to take a step back and have a great day ahead. Thank you so much for your time. And now I'll be doing a quick closing summary of the live stream today. So bye. Thank you. They're all like mouthing because they muted. Okay. So for those who are with us today, you have known that we have invited 3 very special speakers. Unfortunately, not including me, but I'm also very special. So the first speaker who we have is from the Philippines. His name is Xian. I thought it was particularly interesting when he talked about the shift away from profit into a world that is more pro-people and pro-environmental. I think for him, it's very real when he experiences that inequality in suffering these climate consequences, because he lives in Manila, but he's also very aware of the consequences in other rural communities. So for example, he talks about how the 100 energy companies are in charge of producing 71% of carbon emissions, which is insane. It's really insane. And then he was very passionate talking about climate education and how we can bring them into schools all around the world. After that, we have Andrew from Indonesia and Chen Asia. He talked to us about coal-fired power plants in Indonesia, and being a researcher, he was really knowledgeable about it. I was taken aback and also very blown away by what he knows. I think one line that really stood out for me as he was sharing was how we should move away from calling it climate change, but instead refer to it as a climate crisis, because it has been changing for so many years to the point where we know it's an emergency and something has to be done about it. And once again, he flagged out how we have to stop putting the interest of profit and the interest of a small group of people over that of everyone else in the community, which he has witnessed firsthand. And he also talked about how when we talk about divestment and investing in coal power plants, that moving the problem by investing in other countries while claiming our country isn't part of that investment. It's not actually solving the problem, which I thought was quite interesting insight. Lastly, we had Prof Winston Chow, who brought to us many C's, including C for Winston Chow, and also C for IPCC. He had a very insightful approach to what was Singapore's role in the global sphere with his experience in the IPCC, as well as being a prof very specialized in this subject. What I thought was particularly interesting was when he gave us very concrete and niche ways that we could, as a nation, work towards being more sustainable, being a leader in this field, such as targeting big industries, investing in carbon capture. And I thought his message of hope was also something that's quite impactful, because for those who are watching here today who have been quite involved in the environmental scene, it might be something that can be quite draining and demoralizing at times. Some days we just need a break, or some days we just feel like, are we effed, like what he says. But I hope that what all of you have taken away from today's session specifically is that just as how there is a lot of work to do, it also means that there is a lot of work left that we can do. And I hope that each and every one of you have been inspired to find something, your calling, your unique way that you can contribute to the environment. So with that, I would invite Hongyu to now screen share a slide of our feedback form as well as our Fridays for Future recruitment form. So on the right, you will see our recruitment form for Fridays for Future. Please follow us on Instagram to keep continuously updated on what's up with us. If you're interested in the work that we do, which is student outreach and getting in touch with policymakers, please sign yourself up through the form. But as Xian mentioned, we can organize ourselves in many different ways. And if you feel that the way that you want to contribute to the community could be through other organizations, I urge you to seek out for them as well. Many of them were on the panel today, and there are also many, many more that you can look for in the local community. For those who signed up for this live stream through your email, you can look out for a follow-up email with more details about us. And you can also sign up for our newsletter on the website. So for those of you who are wondering what is next for Fridays of For Future, for local students in Singapore, we are currently working with many other organizations to do up a study guide for general paper. I know, studying, boo, but this time, studying guide will be specially focused on climate change topics as well as local social issues, because we also acknowledge that a very big part of taking exams is learning and internalizing the information. And I think it's very interesting how we can use exams as a way to bring real life issues really deeply rooted in the real things that are going on today. So if you could go back to the feedback form slide, we are, after all, a group of youths organizing this event with the help of many, many kind people as well. We want to thank you for coming and tuning in today, and as well as all of our speakers, our panelists, people behind the scenes, our tech support, Kai and Dave, as well as the previous facilitators, Minh and Hongyu, as well as myself. So it would really, really mean a lot to us if you could do the feedback form to tell us how we can improve or how we have done well, so we feel good about ourselves, and also know how we can continue to work better in the future. So we'll be leaving this link in our description as well as in the chat right now. So please do fill it up, and we really hope that you have had a great afternoon tuning in, whether you are working on something else in the background or you have been with us the whole way. We really, really appreciate this, and it's because of the community and you guys who are tuning in that we work so hard. So with that, we wish you a great Saturday and Sunday ahead. Take care of yourselves. Remember to wear your mask, unlike me. And we hope to see you at our next Fridays for Future event. Bye!